Our next speaker is Macke Raymond. She is the director of the Center for Research on Education Outcomes at Stanford University, which analyzes a variety of education reforms and is best known for its analysis of charter schools.
Thank you, Regina. Thank you, Leo, for inviting me. And thank you for whoever ordered that very tasty lunch. I'm a happy tummy. I'm here to share a little bit of information from the research that we have conducted about online charter schools. And before I get into that, I just want to give a little bit of a background about our group and what we try to do and what we try not to do. I'm part of the Center for Research on Education Outcomes at Stanford. And we are an interdisciplinary policy group that uses student-level education data to try to estimate the impact of a variety of school programs and policies. Some of them are reform-oriented, some of them are not. But we have an operating mantra that says we let the data speak. We try very hard not to be pro or anti any of the things that we're looking at, and we just try to let the evidence surface and let it reveal itself to us about how programs or policies are doing. So what that means in practical terms is that we are not pro-charter or anti-district or the reverse of those things. The one thing that we are unassailably for is great schools for all kids. And so when the data aren't particularly good, we have absolutely no problem dishing it. And when the data are good, we have no problem showing that with a good light. So with that as my sort of overall introduction, as Brian mentioned, in 2015, we undertook a pretty comprehensive look of online charter schools across the country. Our group has the benefit of partnering with many states across the country in research collaborations. And in that study, we were able to partner with 23 different states, large states all the way down to really small states. And according to the basic statistical literature from the US Department, we ended up with about 95% of all the online charter school students in our study. So while we did not do a randomized control trial, because our methodology doesn't do that, we have a technique that we have studied and others have studied that give us results that are pretty darn close to RCT style. But we have the additional benefit of being able to speak about many, many more students than would show up in an RCT. So we think those results are pretty robust. And as Brian mentioned, Mathematica did an amazing job of surveying a lot of the online providers, and I was quite surprised at their ability to charm online providers into actually filling out the survey. I'm pretty sure compromising photos were involved. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure. But they got a pretty substantial response rate, and that gave an amazing insight to what was going on under the hood. I want to acknowledge and appreciate that, and then bring some additional information after I share my results. So my team does a matching methodology where we create something called a virtual twin. Now, half of you are going to go to sleep as I say these next 3 sentences, but I'll try to wake you up afterwards. What we try to do is we try to find students who look exactly like our treatment students, and our treatment students at this point are kids who are in online charter schools. Online charter schools meaning they are enrolled for the vast majority of their time in an online environment, not a blended brick and mortar online gig, mostly or completely online. And we found a large number of online providers across the country that we could study. We matched those, and we matched them in 2 different ways. We tried to match them with students who were in brick and mortar charter schools, and we tried to match them with students who were in traditional district schools who did not have either a charter experience or an online charter experience. Does that make sense? So we have sort of 3 buckets. Okay, so we were interested in asking the question, for a typical student enrolled in an online school, what is the academic progress that they make in the course of a year compared to what they would have gotten had they gone to a district school? Okay, so the twin in this case is the district twin. And what we found was really pretty shocking. Chris just spoke about the importance of mathematics as an indicator of school quality. In mathematics, using standardized test score growth from one year to the next, we found that the average student in an online charter school got no academic progress at all. Their progress was as though they didn't go to school. So if you think about 180 days of a school year, the typical kid would have sat down on day one and gone to sleep, and nothing happened for the rest of that year. And these results were ridiculously consistent across grades. Surprised at how many kids are enrolled in online charters from day one, showing up in K, showing up in 1, and these effects were robust across the grade spans. Have a little bit harder time measuring high school because kids only get tested once in high school. But those high school results were equivalent. So a consistent pattern of underperformance in mathematics. The reading results were better, but don't get excited, because in that horse race, compared to the student that they were matched with in district schools, the students show up on the first day of school, and those results show that they only went to school for 108 days out of the 180. All right, so you can see in both cases that they're lagging behind in their academic progress in a year's time. And what that means is that's an active contribution to learning gaps and to eventually achievement gaps. And while you might think that achievement gaps are largely focused on underrepresented minority and poverty students, what we were starting to see in the online world was that there's an entire group of students who are, as Brian mentioned earlier, somehow dispossessed in their other academic settings. And that these students are falling behind in a year's time and in a subsequent year and a subsequent year. The saving grace of all of this, which isn't much of a saving grace, I will admit, is that the length of stay in online schools is not very long. And so I want to paint the picture for you of what happens to a typical kid in the online space. I'll talk about what the providers tell us happen in the year before they go to online school. So for kids who have a district or a charter school experience, they're in an online school, they have a slightly higher mobility rate than their peers. So one possible explanation for why people are doing online is to provide an educationally stable environment, because no matter where you are, you can always plug in. Okay, possible. Slightly higher mobility rate, lower performance in the year before they go to the online school than the typical peer in their school. But they go to online school and their performance, as I just mentioned to you, plummets. Okay, so just think about this. They sort of fall off a cliff when they get into the online space. The typical length of stay is less than 2 years. So somebody is actually watching what happens, and students are returning to either district schools or charter schools, and their performance actually bounces back. And so you think about these people sort of in a U-shaped pattern, right? That they're in the online space for a while and then they go back to a brick and mortar situation, whether it's charter or district, and their performance bounces back. And so I'm unconvinced that the arguments that the providers advance, which I'll talk about in a moment, actually have legitimacy. What I will say is that if you look at the individual student level, there are a cluster of students who do well in the online environment. And these are kids, I'm going to give you some prototypes. We have not identified these kids in our data. I want to be very clear, and don't tell any of my state people that I said this. But there are kids who are professionals of one sort or another. They're actors or they're professional junior athletes. There are kids who are just real brainiacs in one side or another, and their existing school experience doesn't satisfy, and so they want to be cut loose. Right? Or there are kids for whom literally a social environment that includes lots of other kids is just too nerve-wracking for them. And so for their own well-being, they do better in a softer, more structured environment at home. For those kids, and I'm not saying I've got a one-to-one tie here, but I'm just giving you those icons of kids. For those kids, we do see that there is a strong positive experience for some kids. And I want to hold on to that for a second because I want to go back and talk about what the operators tell us. So for those of us who have been in the business for a long time, we see eras of your go-to explanation for why things don't work. And when I first started, the go-to explanation was that everybody had Asperger's, right? Who here remembers the Asperger era, right? Raise your hands, come on, let's be honest. Yeah, okay. The second one that we heard, and this was in play when we were doing the work, was that every single student in an online school was bullied. Well, the Office of Civil Rights has come up with some pretty important data that shows that that couldn't possibly be the case. Like, that just isn't true. Even if every single kid who was reported to be bullied was in an online school, it doesn't account for the online population. And we know that there are still kids in district and charter schools who suffer from bullying. So bullying can't be the real reason. And I'll give you the data to support this. Remember, I told you that the kids are in a lower state in the year, lower performing in the year that they are last in the school in which they're supposed to have been bullied. Let me just put that on there, right? You would think that if bullying was the detractor and you removed bullying from the equation, that their scores would go up. We don't see that. They go the other way. And what we also see is that when they go back, they're going back often to the same school. We check that out, often to the same school. You wouldn't put your kid back in the same school where they were bullied, I wouldn't think, unless there's been a massive sea change, and yet their scores go back up. So I'm unconvinced by what we see in the data that that is as generalized a reason as some of the providers. And the most recent one, and I don't know how to think about this, is that these are students who have all experienced trauma. So I can see in some states where there have been massive numbers of natural disasters, Texas and the floods, the hurricane and Katrina, so forth and so on, I can see that online education goes up after that, but their results are no worse than all of the other students who did not experience those kinds of things. That's not to say there isn't other forms of trauma, right? We tried to look at places where the murder rate was higher, where violent crime and domestic crime were higher. We saw no relationship there. It's a really long causal link, so I'm not surprised that we didn't. But we just don't see the super tight link between trauma and the results that we're seeing to really be able to get behind that. So why do families put their kids in online schools? Drawing off of work that we have done more recently, we do state-specific studies, and I've been spending a lot of time in states where there are a lot of families who have a fundamental mistrust of the system. Can you get that picture in your head without putting any labels on it? Okay. And the uptake in online schools is really strong there. They're not enrolling their kids in online programs. They're homeschooling their kids, and they're enrolling in online so that they can get a curriculum. And they don't actually put any stock in any of the things that we're talking about, because what they value is they're keeping their kids in an environment where they are, according to the parents, protected and being exposed to appropriate social norms and values. And so if we want to use test scores as the standard, then they're failing. If you want to use parental choice as the standard, they might not be failing, because lots and lots of families are doing this for family-based reasons, not for academic reasons. Which brings me to the last point that I wanted to make, which is all of the results that I've been sharing with you are results at the mean. I have told you that there are some students who do well. I also want to let you know there are some programs, really small programs, that do well. And the reason that I am loath to to go to state capitals and advocate for burning it all down is because I think ultimately online education is going to become a much bigger part of public education in the decades to come for reasons of shortages of labor, for geographic problems, for physical facilities not being available or not being up to standards, and so you have to do something else. I think online education is actually going to be a growing part of K-12. And so I don't want to eliminate the possibility that we have some exemplars that we could learn from and build from, or that we identify some groups of students, as Brian was saying earlier, for whom online education is actually a positive benefit, and let that be the base of growth. At the other end of the spectrum, I have no problem calling out authorizers and state leaders who take money. So the authorizers don't take money, but I have seen convincing evidence that a lot of places where online education is terrible and is perpetuated, that it's a political deal. And that, I think, is criminal because that's putting adults ahead of students. With that, I'll give it a go.
Hey, thank you, thank you, thank you. Again, I remind you, if you have a question, please put it on the index card.